Leningrad, September 8th, 1941. The last road out of the city closed that morning. Not metaphorically, not as a strategic assessment or a military report. Physically closed. The German army group north completed its encirclement of the city, cutting the last land connection between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union. And 3 million people woke up that morning inside a ring of steel that would not open for 872 days. They did not know it would be 872 days. Nobody knew that on September 8th, 1941. What they knew, what became apparent within weeks with the cold, specific clarity of arithmetic that cannot be argued with, was that the food inside the city would not last, that the Germans were not going to attack, that they were going to wait, that the plan was not conquest but starvation, that Hitler had decided Leningrad was not worth the casualties of a direct assault when hunger would accomplish the same result at no cost to the Wehrmacht. The plan was to let the city die. Leningrad did not die. What happened instead across 872 days of siege, of winter temperatures that killed people in the streets, of daily artillery bombardment, of a hunger so absolute that the word famine does not adequately contain what it actually was, is one of the most extraordinary acts of collective human endurance in recorded history. And the question it leaves, the question that 872 days of choosing to survive instead of surrender asks about what human beings are capable of when the alternative is unthinkable, can only be witnessed.
1 million people died in the Siege of Leningrad. Not soldiers, civilians, men and women and children who had not chosen to be in a city that the German army had decided to starve into submission, who had not chosen the war, had not chosen the siege, had not chosen the specific, daily, grinding arithmetic of a blockade that reduced the bread ration to 125 grams per person per day. A slice of bread mixed with sawdust and paper to extend the flour. That was the difference between living and dying for hundreds of thousands of people through the winter of 1941 to 1942. 1 million dead in one city, in one siege, in 872 days. More Soviet civilians died in the Siege of Leningrad than the United States and Britain combined lost in the entire Second World War. This is not a battle. It is not a campaign. It is not a military operation in any conventional sense of those words. It is the story of what happens when a modern army decides that a city full of people is an obstacle to be removed through attrition. And the city decides collectively and without the option of retreat that it is not going to be removed. Leningrad held, at a cost that resists comprehension, in conditions that resist description, by people who had no particular reason to believe they were going to survive and who kept going anyway, kept working, kept composing music, kept teaching children in schools without heat, kept writing in diaries that they had no certainty anyone would ever read, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping in Leningrad in the winter of 1941 meant dying. So they did not stop.
To understand Leningrad, you must first understand what it meant. Not strategically, not militarily, but symbolically, historically, in the specific way that certain cities carry the weight of what they represent beyond the weight of their buildings in their streets. Leningrad was not merely a city. It was the former capital of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg, founded by Peter the Great in 1703 on the marshes of the Neva Delta as a declaration that Russia was turning toward Europe, that it was claiming its place among the civilized nations of the West, that the empire of the Tsars was capable of building something as magnificent as anything in Paris or Vienna or Amsterdam. The city that Peter built became one of the most beautiful in Europe. The Winter Palace, the Hermitage, which contained one of the greatest art collections in the world and which the museum staff spent the first days of the siege packing into crates and evacuating east, working around the clock, moving Rembrandts and Rubens and Leonardo drawings into freight cars while the German army closed the ring. The palaces of Tsarskoye Selo and Peterhof,
the canals and the bridges and the wide avenues that gave the city the specific northern, grey-skied grandeur of a place that had been built to impress. It had been renamed Leningrad in 1924 after Lenin's death, in the way that Soviet power renamed everything, converting the symbols of the old order into monuments to the new one. But the city itself remained what Peter had made it, a statement, an argument made in stone and bronze and water that Russia was capable of permanence. Hitler wanted to erase it, not occupy it, not administer it, erase it. The orders issued by the German High Command regarding Leningrad were explicit. The city was to be blockaded, its population starved, its buildings destroyed by artillery and air bombardment, and when it had been sufficiently reduced, it was to be leveled so that no trace remained of what had been there. The plan was not conquest, it was obliteration. The specific reason for this was partly strategic. Leningrad was a major industrial center and a naval base, and partly ideological. Leningrad was the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, the city where the cruiser Aurora had fired the shot that signaled the storming of the Winter Palace in 1917. Destroying it was destroying the origin point of the regime that Germany had come to eliminate. And partly it was simply that a direct assault on Leningrad would cost German lives at a rate that the Wehrmacht, already stretched across the vast distances of the Soviet Union, could not afford. Hunger was cheaper.
The first winter was the worst. This is the sentence that appears in every account of the siege, and it is true in the specific, measurable way that certain historical facts are true, not as rhetoric or as narrative framing, but as a statement that the numbers support without ambiguity. The bread ration of 125 grams per day for dependent civilians, those not doing physical labor, not serving in the military, was reached in November 1941 and sustained through the winter. 125 grams, less than a quarter of the minimum caloric requirement for an adult human body at rest, in temperatures that dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, in apartments without heat, without electricity, without running water. With German artillery shelling the city daily, not strategically, not targeting military installations, but systematically, street by street, building by building, in the specific pattern of bombardment designed to kill people and destroy infrastructure and remind everyone inside the ring that the ring was still there. People died in the streets. This is not a figure of speech. They died walking, collapsed from hunger and cold, sometimes singly, sometimes in groups, sometimes entire families found in their apartments, having died in their sleep when the temperature fell low enough. The city formed brigades to collect the dead, teams of surviving citizens who went out each morning with sledges to gather the bodies that had accumulated overnight and transport them to mass graves outside the city. The children's diaries from this period are the most devastating documents of the siege, not because they describe extraordinary suffering in extraordinary language. They do not. They describe extraordinary suffering in the matter-of-fact language of children recording what they see because they do not yet have the emotional vocabulary to understand what it means. Tanya Savichev was 11 years old when the siege began. She kept a notebook. In it, she recorded in alphabetical order the deaths of her family members as they occurred through the winter of 1941 to 1942. Zhenya died on 28th December at 12 o'clock noon, 1941. Grandma died on 25th January, 3 o'clock, 1942. Lekka died on 17th March at 5 o'clock in the morning, 1942. Uncle Vasya died on 13th April at 2 o'clock at night, 1942. Uncle Lyosha on 10th May at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 1942. Mother on 13th May at 7:30 a.m., 1942. The Savichevs died. Everyone died. Only Tanya is left. Tanya was evacuated from Leningrad in 1942.
She died in 1944 from the effects of dystrophy and the diseases that had accumulated during the siege. She was 14 years old. Her notebook is in the Museum of the History of St. Petersburg. It has been there since the war ended. It is the size of a small address book. It contains 6 pages of entries.
Lake Ladoga. The only gap in the German encirclement was the eastern shore of Lake Ladoga, a vast body of water northeast of the city that the Germans did not control. In summer, it was navigable by boat. Barges could cross it carrying supplies, though German aircraft attacked the convoys constantly and the losses were severe. In winter, it froze. And when it froze thick enough, when the ice reached the depth that Soviet engineers calculated could support the weight of a loaded truck, a road was built across it. The road of life, the ice road, the supply route that kept Leningrad from complete starvation through the winters of the siege. It was not a road in any conventional sense. It was a track marked by posts driven into the ice, maintained by workers who repaired the damage from German bombing around the clock, traveled by drivers who knew that the ice might not hold, that German aircraft were watching, that a truck breaking through the ice in -30-degree temperatures was a death that would be neither quick nor recoverable. They drove anywhere. Convoys of trucks moving across the frozen lake at night, headlights off to avoid the bombers, keeping distance between vehicles to distribute the weight, listening for the sounds of cracking ice that meant the road was about to end. On the return journey, driving back to the eastern shore, the trucks carried children. Leningrad evacuated its children across the ice road during the winters of the siege, moving them out of the city in the trucks that had just delivered food, wrapping them in whatever clothing was available, sending them east towards safety. Many of them did not survive the journey. Many of the ones who did never fully recovered from what the siege had done to their bodies in the months before the evacuation. The road of life was not enough to end the hunger. It was enough to prevent the complete starvation that Hitler had planned. It was the difference between a city that died and a city that survived, measured in grams of bread per truck per crossing, across 800 kilometers of frozen water, under German bombs, in the dark.
Dmitri Shostakovich was working on his Seventh Symphony when the siege began. He had started it before the German invasion. The first movement was sketched in July 1941, before anyone knew what was coming. When the siege closed around Leningrad in September, he continued working on it in the city, under bombardment, in an apartment that was growing colder as the fuel ran out. He completed the first 3 movements in Leningrad before being evacuated east in October. He finished the symphony in Kuibyshev in December 1941. It premiered there in March 1942 and was performed in Moscow in April. The score was microfilmed and flown to Tehran, then Cairo, then across Africa to the United States, where Arturo Toscanini conducted the American premiere with the NBC Symphony Orchestra in July 1942. The performance was broadcast nationally. Tens of millions of people heard it. And then, on August 9, 1942, it was performed in Leningrad. The date was not chosen randomly. August 9th was the date on which the German military documents had projected that Leningrad would fall. German forces had even scheduled a celebration at the Hotel Astoria, a banquet for the commanders who would have accepted the city's surrender. The Radio Orchestra of Leningrad had been reduced by death and evacuation to 15 musicians. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, weighed 47 kilos. Some of the musicians had to be brought to rehearsal on sledges because they were too weak to walk. Military personnel were recalled from the front lines to fill the orchestra. Soldiers who played instruments brought back from the trenches to sit in a concert hall in a besieged city and perform a symphony. The hall was full. The performance was broadcast over loudspeakers throughout the city so that everyone who could not attend could hear it. It was also broadcast over loudspeakers pointed toward the German lines so that the soldiers who had been waiting for Leningrad to die could hear what Leningrad was doing instead. The symphony lasted 74 minutes. When it ended, the audience did not leave. They sat in the silence that follows music that can say something that cannot be said any other way. And then they applauded. In a city where 1 million people would eventually die of hunger and cold and bombardment, where the daily bread ration had been a slice mixed with sawdust, where children had been recording the deaths of their families in alphabetical order in small notebooks, they applauded. This is the detail that defines the Siege of Leningrad more completely than any military statistic. Not the numbers, not the road of life, not the eventual lifting of the blockade in January 1944. The performance of a symphony in a besieged city on the date the Germans had scheduled the city's surrender, by an orchestra that had to be assembled from the front lines because most of the musicians were dead. That is what Leningrad was. That is what it refused to stop being, even when stopping would have been the rational response to everything that was happening to it.
January 18, 1943. Soviet forces broke through the German lines south at Lake Ladoga and opened a narrow land corridor to the city, 3 kilometers wide. Barely enough for a railway line that was constructed in 17 days under continuing German artillery fire. It was not the end of the siege. The German encirclement was not fully broken for another year, but it was the beginning of the end. The first land connection between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union since September 8, 1941. The final lifting of the blockade came on January 27, 1944, 872 days after the ring closed. That evening, the city erupted in fireworks, salvos fired by Soviet artillery that had spent 872 days defending what they were now celebrating. The people of Leningrad came into the streets and watched the sky above their city light up with something other than German bombs for the first time in nearly 3 years. The official count of civilian dead in the Siege of Leningrad, the number that appears in the historical record that was established by Soviet and later Russian investigations, is approximately 800,000 to 1 million. Some estimates place it higher. The uncertainty itself is part of the record. So many people died in so many circumstances across so long a period that the precise count has never been fully established. The German forces that had besieged the city suffered approximately 500,000 casualties of their own, killed, wounded, captured in the operations around Leningrad over the same period. The city they had planned to erase is still there. It is called St. Petersburg again, the name restored after the fall of the Soviet Union, the city returning to what Peter the Great had called it. The Hermitage is still there. The art that was evacuated in the first days of the siege returned to its walls after the war. The Winter Palace is still there. The canals and the bridges and the wide avenues are still there. The mass graves are still there too. The Piskaryovsky Memorial Cemetery contains the remains of approximately 500,000 people, soldiers and civilians buried together, most in mass graves, most unidentified. The inscriptions on the memorial are simple. They recall numbers, not names. There were too many names.
Tanya Savicheva's notebook asks a question that has no comfortable answer. Not about the Germans. Their culpability is not in question. Not about the Soviet command. The decisions made in Moscow about whether to defend or evacuate Leningrad are complex and contested, but they are not the heart of what the notebook asks. The notebook asks what it means for a city, for a collection of human beings sharing a geography and a history and a set of conditions imposed on them by circumstances they did not choose, to decide that it is not going to stop. Not heroically, not in the cinematic way that the word heroism implies, the single moment of decision, the clear choice between courage and cowardice, the dramatic gesture that history can point to as the turning point. In the specific, daily, unglamorous way that survival actually works. Getting up in the morning in an apartment with no heat, going to work in a factory that was being shelled, waiting in line for a bread ration that was not enough, recording in a small notebook the names of the people who had not made it through the night, and doing it again the next day and the day after that for 872 days. The Seventh Symphony was performed in Leningrad on the date the Germans had celebrated because someone decided that it should be. That decision, the decision to perform a symphony in a starving city under siege as an act of defiance so specific that it was broadcast toward the German lines, is not a military decision. It is a human decision. The kind that does not appear in operational orders or strategic assessments or the documents that historians use to reconstruct what happened. It appears in the music itself, in the 74 minutes of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, performed by an orchestra assembled from the front lines, conducted by a man who weighed 47 kilos, heard by an audience who sat in silence afterward and then applauded because there was nothing else adequate to do. Some cities are defined by what they built, some by what they lost. Leningrad is defined by what it refused to lose. Not the buildings, many of which were destroyed, not the population, 1 million of whom died, but something harder to name and harder to destroy. The willingness to perform a symphony on the date scheduled for your own surrender. The specific, unreasonable, historically extraordinary refusal to accept that the ring closing around you means that what is inside the ring is over. 1 million people died in the Siege of Leningrad. 1 million people who had not chosen the siege, had not chosen the war, had not chosen to be inside a ring of steel in the worst winter in memory with 125 grams of bread between them and starvation. They did not all survive. Most of them did not survive. But the city survived. And the city surviving, the specific fact of Leningrad still existing on January 27, 1944, when the blockade was lifted, is the answer that 872 days of dying gave to the question of what it was all for. It was for this, for the city still being there, for the music still being played, for the children who were evacuated across the ice road and survived and grew up in a world that existed in part because Leningrad had not fallen. Some things are worth every cost. Not because the cost is acceptable, it is not, it never is. 1 million dead is not acceptable by any accounting that takes human life seriously, but because the alternative of a world in which Leningrad fell, in which the German plan succeeded, in which hunger accomplished what the Wehrmacht had decided not to attempt with force, is a world that is worse than the one that cost 1 million lives to preserve. Tanya Savichev recorded every death in her family in alphabetical order in a small notebook. She was 11 years old when she started. She wrote at the end, "Everyone died, only Tanya is left." Tanya did not survive either, but the notebook did. And the notebook being there, in a museum in the city that refused to fall, read by people who live in a world that exists because the city refused to fall, is the only answer available to the question of whether it was worth it. History does not give better answers than that. It gives the ones it has. Leningrad held, at a cost that cannot be calculated without breaking something in the person doing the calculating. And the city is still there. If this story stayed with you, If Tanya's notebook and the symphony and the ice road and the 872 days mean something to you, there are more of them waiting. Every siege, every impossible hold, every city that refused to stop. Subscribe to Dash History and stay.